Everyday English Podcast
by English Talking Today.
Hello, English language learners, and welcome back to another episode of English Talking Today. My name is Mary, and today we're diving into a topic that can be a little bit intense, but it's incredibly important, and it's full of some really useful, real-world English vocabulary and phrases. Today, we're talking about the emergency room. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Mary, an emergency room? That sounds a bit scary for a language lesson. And yes, emergencies themselves are definitely not fun, but the language used in these critical situations is fascinating and crucial to understand, especially if you ever find yourself in a situation where you need to communicate about medical care. And let's be honest, who doesn't love a good medical drama, even if it's just in a podcast? So, whether you're a healthcare professional, someone living in an English-speaking country, or just a curious language learner, this episode is for you. All right, so let's start with some foundational vocabulary that you're very likely to hear in an emergency room, or ER, as it's often called for short. You know, doctors and nurses often use a lot of abbreviations because things happen quickly and they need to communicate efficiently. The first one, and probably one of the most widely known, is CPR. That's CPR. It stands for cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Now, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Let's break it down. Cardio refers to the heart, and pulmonary refers to the lungs. Resuscitation means to revive someone, to bring them back to consciousness or life. So, CPR is a procedure used when someone's heart has stopped beating or they've stopped breathing. It involves chest compressions and rescue breaths to manually circulate blood and oxygen to the brain and other vital organs. It's truly a life-saving technique. When you hear start CPR or he's getting CPR, it means someone is in a very serious situation. Next up, another common abbreviation, BP. This stands for blood pressure. Blood pressure is the force of your blood pushing against the walls of your arteries. Doctors and nurses measure it regularly, especially in the ER, to get a quick understanding of a patient's cardiovascular health. You might hear, what's his BP, or her BP is a little low. It's a very common vital sign that they monitor. Now, let's get into some more specific medical conditions and procedures. The first one is acute respiratory failure. Acute means it's sudden and severe, and respiratory failure means the lungs are failing to get enough oxygen into the blood or to remove carbon dioxide. Basically, it means a person has stopped breathing or is struggling very, very severely to breathe, and it's a critical, life-threatening condition. If someone is in acute respiratory failure, immediate intervention is needed. And what might that intervention be? Often, it involves a procedure called intubation. To intubate someone means a medical professional inserts a long, flexible tube into a patient's mouth down their windpipe to help them breathe. This tube is then usually connected to a ventilator, which is a machine that breathes for the patient. It's a pretty invasive procedure, but absolutely necessary when someone can't breathe on their own. You might hear a doctor say, "We need to intubate him now," or "she's been intubated." Following closely on the heels of intubation, we have a bit of medical slang. And you know, every profession has its own slang, right? In the ER, you might hear a doctor or nurse say, "Bag him," "BG him." This might sound a little strange if you're not in the medical field. Bag him is medical slang for a procedure where a bag, often called an ambu bag, is attached to an intubation tube, and a medical professional squeezes it to manually put air into a patient's lungs. It's often done before a patient is fully connected to a ventilator, or if there's an issue with the ventilator. So, when you hear bag him, it doesn't mean put him in a plastic bag. It means provide manual ventilation. Okay, let's talk about the severity of a patient's condition. You'll often hear the term critical condition. If a patient is in critical condition, it means they are in a very serious state. They're either very sick or very badly hurt, and there's a real possibility that they could die soon. It requires constant monitoring and immediate medical attention. It's the most serious level of medical urgency. You might hear, the patient is in critical condition following the accident. When doctors are working on a patient in critical condition, their immediate goal is often to stabilize them. To stabilize means to take a patient out of immediate danger. It means their vital signs are no longer rapidly worsening, and they're out of the most immediate, life-threatening danger. However, they may still be very, very sick or injured. So, we've stabilized him means they've managed to get the patient to a point where they are no longer actively dying, but they're not necessarily out of the woods yet. Which actually brings us to an idiom we'll talk about in a moment. After a patient is stabilized, especially if they are still very sick or need intensive monitoring, they might be transferred to the ICU. ICU. This stands for Intensive Care Unit. The ICU is a specialized department in a hospital where patients in critical condition receive a higher level of care and are monitored regularly by a team of highly trained doctors and nurses. It's for the sickest patients who need constant attention and specialized equipment. He's been moved to the ICU means he's still very sick, but hopefully on the road to recovery with specialized care. Excellent. We've covered some really important vocabulary there. Now, let's shift our focus to some key phrases and idioms that are commonly used, not just in medical settings, but also in everyday English, and they certainly pop up in the context of an emergency. The first phrase is to hook up. Hook up. This means to connect something, usually electronically or mechanically. In the ER, you might hear, hook him up to the monitor, or hook up the Ford drip. It means to attach wires, tubes, or other equipment. But you can also use hook up in a non-medical context, like I need to hook up my new speakers to the TV, or can you help me hook up the printer? It just means to connect. Another very useful phrase, especially if you're trying to cooperate with medical staff, is hold still. Hold still. This simply means to stop moving. If a doctor or nurse needs to examine you, give you an injection, or perform a procedure, they will often ask you to hold still so they can do their job accurately and safely. You'll hear this a lot with children. Please hold still for the shot. But it's also common for adults. And finally, an idiom that's incredibly relevant to our ER theme, out of the woods. Out of the woods. This idiom means to be free from danger or difficulty. When someone is in critical condition and they start to improve, doctors might say, he's not completely out of the woods yet, but he's making progress. It means they're still in a risky situation, but the most severe danger has passed. If someone is out of the woods, it means they are no longer in a life-threatening situation or have overcome a significant challenge. Think of it like being lost in a dark forest, the woods, and finally finding your way out to safety. It's a very optimistic and hopeful phrase. Now that we have a solid foundation of vocabulary and phrases, let's put it all into context with a dramatic dialogue. Imagine you're in an emergency room, and these are the kinds of hurried, intense conversations you might overhear. Try to pick out the words and phrases we just discussed.
Nurse Miller, what do we have?
Dr. Reynolds, we have a code blue. Patient John, male, approximately 3 years old. Found unresponsive, not breathing. Suspected acute respiratory failure.
All right, let's move quickly. Get him on the gurney right now. Is anyone doing CPR?
Paramedics initiated CPR en route. They're still doing chest compressions.
Good. Let's get him to trauma room 1. Clear the way. Come on, little guy. Stay with us. Nurse, get me the intubation kit. I need to intubate him immediately. We need to get some air into those lungs.
On it, doctor. Kit's here.
Suction ready. Tube going in. Okay, he's intubated. Now, bag him. Let's get some oxygen flowing. What's his BP? Get a pulse oximeter on him.
BP is very low, doctor. 60/40. Oxygen saturation is at 70%, slowly rising with bagging.
Keep bagging. We need to get that saturation up. I also need an 4-access stat. Let's get some fluids in him. He's in critical condition, nurse. We need to stabilize him first.
4-access established, doctor. Fluids are running. Saturation is now at 80%.
Good. That's good. Keep it up. Let's get him hooked up to the ventilator as soon as we can. We need to support his breathing long term. And let's get a full set of labs. We need to find out what's causing this.
Ventilator is ready, doctor. Connecting now.
Okay, he's on the vent. Pressure's still low, but it's not dropping. His heart rate is coming up. He's still very weak, but we've managed to stabilize him for now. He's definitely not out of the woods yet. We need to transfer him to the ICU for continuous monitoring.
Understood. I'll arrange the transfer to the pediatric ICU. You did good, John.
Wow, intense, right? You can really feel the urgency in that situation. Did you catch all the vocabulary and phrases? We heard CPR, acute respiratory failure, intubate, bag him, BP, critical condition, stabilize, hook up, and not out of the woods yet, and of course, ICU. Now, you might have been imagining a human patient named John, perhaps a young boy, given the 3 years old and little guy comments. Well, here's the surprise I mentioned. At the end, Nurse Miller said, "You did good, John." And if you listened very carefully, she also referred to him as he, but then said pediatric ICU. Are you ready for the twist? Patient John is actually a dog. Yes, a 3-year-old canine. The dialogue was about a veterinary emergency. Sometimes, doctors will use pediatric ICU to refer to the intensive care unit for young animals or specifically for animal patients in general, especially if it's a veterinary teaching hospital. I hope that didn't throw you off too much. It just goes to show how adaptable and widely used these medical terms are, even across species. I wanted to include that little surprise because often, when we think of emergency rooms, we immediately think of human hospitals. But veterinary emergency rooms are just as intense and use very similar medical terminology and procedures. And speaking of pet emergencies, this brings me to a personal story. It actually happened a few years ago with my own cat. Luna is an indoor cat, but one day, a few years ago, she managed to sneak out when the front door was accidentally left open for just a moment. I was frantic looking for her. About an hour later, a neighbor found her by the side of the road, and it was clear she had been hit by a car. My heart just sank. It was absolutely terrifying. I rushed her to the nearest 24-hour animal emergency hospital. It looked very much like a human ER, just smaller. The vets and vet techs were amazing. They immediately took her back. They told me she was in critical condition and that they needed to stabilize her. They did an X-ray and found she had some internal bleeding and a broken leg. They had to hook her up to an 4-drip for fluids and give her oxygen. I remember the vet explaining that they were monitoring her BP very closely because it was quite low. They worked on her for hours, and I just sat in the waiting room, praying she would be okay. It was agonizing. Finally, the vet came out and told me that they had managed to stabilize her. She was still very sick, and they were concerned about her internal injuries, but she was no longer in immediate life-threatening danger. However, she wasn't out of the woods yet. They said she needed intensive care and recommended she stay in the animal ICU for a few days so they could monitor her constantly and manage her pain. I visited her every day in the ICU. It was a really sterile environment, but the staff were so kind to all the animals. She was hooked up to all sorts of machines, and it was tough to see her like that. But slowly, day by day, she started to improve. Her breathing became more regular, her pain was managed, and she even started to purr softly when I talked to her. After 5 long days, the vet told me she was finally out of the woods and could come home. It was such a relief. She had a long recovery ahead with her broken leg, but she made it. She's now a happy, healthy, and very much indoor-only cat again, and I cherish every moment with her. So, that personal experience really brought home to me the importance of these medical terms, even for our furry friends. It's a reminder that emergencies can happen to anyone, or anything we love, and being able to understand the language around medical care is incredibly valuable. All right, everyone, that brings us to the end of another episode of English Talking Today. I hope you found this deep dive into emergency room English both informative and engaging. We covered a lot of ground today, from essential vocabulary like CPR, BP, acute respiratory failure, intubate, and bag him, to important concepts like critical condition, stabilize, and the ICU. And we also learned some useful phrases and idioms like hook up, hold still, and out of the woods. Remember, the best way to internalize this vocabulary is to practice it. Try to create your own sentences using these words, or even imagine scenarios where you might hear or use them. You can also re-listen to this episode and try to identify the terms as they are used. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the English Talking Today YouTube channel so you don't miss any future lessons. And if you have a moment, leaving a like or a comment would be fantastic. I love hearing from all of you. What other English topics would you like me to cover? Let me know. Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep practicing your English, keep learning, and I'll talk to you again very soon.